So let's go into the details of creating these triggers. Well, there's a lot of different places where you can create triggers within our tooling. So there's the setup menu, there's the Force.com IDE. So there's a number of places where you can create them or edit them. Here we are taking a look at a screenshot, simply right-clicking anywhere within our project and then selecting New Apex Trigger. All right, so when we create a new Apex trigger, what syntax do we get? Well, first of all, there's the trigger keyword, and then we have the name of our trigger, and the trigger is on a single object. So you can't create a trigger that is universal, nor can you create a trigger that is on multiple objects. So we associate our trigger, much like we have down here. So trigger mileage trigger on, in this case, the custom object called mileage. And then we have the different events that we want to have our trigger fire on. So there is before of insert, update, and delete, and then there's after of insert, update, delete, and then also after undelete. Okay? There is no before undelete. I suspect that the reason there is no before undelete is that the purpose of a before trigger is to modify a record, and if we are undeleting, we must be working with a record in a recycle bin, and by definition a record in the recycle bin cannot be modified. It must be exhumed from the recycle bin, then we can modify it and do what we want to do. So I don't actually know the concrete, real reason, but I suspect it has to do with the fact that those records are unmodifiable. All right. You can have one or many of these different events. So in this case, you might have, before insert and after delete, but if any of these events occur, it will then fire off the code within your trigger. All right. So we have this concept of trigger context variables. So there are certain variables or certain classes which are available to you when you are running within the context of a trigger. There is these trigger dot is before, is insert, for all those different variations on the events. So you can write some logic to check to see, well, if I have a trigger that fires off on before insert or before update, I can check to see, well, am I firing because it's a new record, or am I firing because it's an existing record that I'm modifying? Okay. There's trigger.new, we talked about that. Trigger.new map, it's available in before update, after insert, and after update triggers, and this represents the new copy of the record in a map where the key is the ID of the records. Trigger.new map does not exist when we're doing a before insert. Why does trigger.new map not exist in a before insert? There's no ID to use as our key. Why does trigger.new not exist in a delete? There's no new version of the record. We're only deleting the old version of the record. Very good. Okay. Trigger.old. Trigger.old is a list of the previous versions of the records. Obviously, it doesn't exist in any inserts because there is no old version in an insert. Old map maps the IDs of the previous versions to the S objects, the IDs, and then size just returns the number of records in your trigger. Okay, so here we are using our trigger.new and trigger.old, iterating over them. So often what you're doing is you're right there in your trigger, you're iterating over trigger.new. We talked about how you can only modify your data in a before trigger. Trigger.old, you can't modify trigger.old. There's no point. You're about to overwrite it or you're about to delete it, one of the two. So it does not allow you to modify trigger.old. So here's an example of some code, and the purpose of this code is to show you how you could do a comparison between the new version of a record or records and the old version of those records. So what we could do, in this case, this is firing on a before update, so we have access to both the new and the old. We could iterate over trigger.new, here we have the new version of the status field. We can compare it to the old version of the status field by doing a lookup using old map and using the ID as the lookup criteria. Okay? All right. When you create multiple triggers, one of the problems you'd run into, so let's say I have 2 triggers that execute on before insert. In a perfect world, you don't want to get into that situation, and the reason is that you don't know which of those triggers is going to be executed first and which one is going to be executed second. So there's no guarantees that Salesforce makes in terms of order of execution of those triggers. So in our best practice that we recommend is that you do something where you have either a single trigger per object, or if you have a single trigger per object per event, so up to 7 triggers per object. And that way, you have a single trigger, and now the purpose of the trigger is it would then call helper methods within your classes. Therefore, the entire purpose of the trigger is to contain the delegation logic to go out to your helper code to do whatever it is that you need to be done. And since you're the one writing the calls to the helper methods, you control the order of execution. Okay? So in this case, taking a look at this code, here if it's a before delete, we're going to call helper method 1, then helper method 2, etc. Okay? Bulkifier triggers. So we're going to be passed between 1 and 200 records in trigger.new. So it's your job to make sure that when you're executing your trigger and you're iterating over trigger.new, or if you're in a helper method and you're iterating over that list, it's your job to make sure that you're not surrounding that with surrounding things like SOQL statements and DML operations. Okay? So make sure that you're operating in bulk utilizing lists. Okay? So if we're creating thousands of, here in this case, this use case is that from candidate records, we would create contact records. So let's say we have a trigger which will, anytime a candidate record is created, we want to create an associated contact record. Okay? Here are 2 separate triggers. Which one is good and which one is bad?
First one's bad.
Yeah, why is the first one bad?
One dependent.
Yeah, it's line 4A. Very bad. And then is the second example good or bad?
It's fine.
Yeah. Should be good, because we know that trigger.new will be a maximum of up to 200 records. We're going to do a single DML operation on up to, therefore, 200 records. So it should be good. Okay. All right, so how do we prevent records from being committed to the database? Well, the way that we do it is there is a method called addError. addError is a method associated with SObject. So you apply it on a record-by-record basis. Okay. Interesting thing about addError is that you can call addError on an individual SObject or on a field on that SObject. So I can do, let's say I have a position called P. I could do P.addError, or I could do P.hiringmanager:C.addError. Now the difference between calling addError on the record versus calling it on the field all has to do with the way that we display error messages on our page layouts. So if you apply it on the, much like, and this is exactly like a validation rule, when you indicate that you want the error message to be displayed at the top of the page versus being associated with an individual field. Okay. All right, here's some example of some code. This one happens to be a before trigger, but it could very well be an after trigger. We're iterating over trigger.new. We're taking a look to see if our email is null. We're checking this map, see if it contains it or whatever. And if it is, we're going to call addError. This will then prevent that particular record from being written to the database. Okay. How do you prevent a duplicate lead from being saved to if the lead's email address already exists in your application within your database? So looks like we do exactly what we're doing here, which is to select from the database the values of the email field from our database. There's other issues that you'd run into where you might have recursive trigger execution, and we'll take a look at a design pattern that you can do. Basically what this is going to do in this scenario, essentially upon the insert of a record, we want to insert another record of the same type. So in this case, if we insert into this dictionary object, if we insert a cup and we indicate that mug is a related word, and we indicate that it is a synonym, we want to have a trigger that inserts mug indicating that cup is a synonym to this. So we're kind of doing this cross-linking, if you will. So if mug is a synonym to cup, then cup is a synonym to mug. And so we need to have two synonym entries. Okay? So, so what problem might occur? So what problem might occur in this situation? So we have a trigger that, let's say it executes on after insert, like this one. And anytime we're inserting a word, we're going to insert its synonym. In this case, we didn't have any uniqueness requirement, so conceivably you could just have another cup entry. But the problem here is that this trigger is, because it fires on after insert, by inserting a new record, it will fire off the trigger again. So what's going to happen here is that there's this, in this case, this maximum trigger depth exceeded, which is recursive callings of triggers. It's gonna basically, there's a, I think 15 or 10 is the number of times after which we'll stop it. All right, so we have a design pattern that we're going to talk about where we're going to use static variables to prevent this recursive trigger from going crazy and trying to keep adding synonyms to itself. So let's take a look at some code that's going to prevent our recursive trigger from going at, so not creating a synonym to the synonym. So that's our goal, is we don't want to create the synonym to the synonym. So we want to create one synonym and then stop. So what we have here, we have a public class, and we have our static Boolean called end the trigger call stack. Okay? Now, the first thing we do in our trigger is we check the value of this. And if it is equal to false, then what we're going to do is we're going to iterate over our records. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through the process of generating the synonym. We're going to generate the new record. We're then going to flip the Boolean, and then we're going to insert our record into the database. Okay? Let's answer this question though. What value should Ryan provide for this right here in line 2A? All right, so we're going to initialize it to false, and then what should this be? True, exactly. So we're going to set a static variable, initialize it to false. We are going to only perform the insert if it is equal to false, but before we perform the insert, we're going to flip it over to true, and that'll prevent the second execution of the trigger from attempting to create the third record. Make sense? All right. I just noticed in the slide, why is this bad coding? We just violated the principles that we've been talking about. What's especially bad about this code?
We're doing the insert on line 10B for each.
Ah, there we go. So the maximum number of DML operations that you can perform in a transaction is 150. And if we are past 200 records, then what's going to happen is when it attempts to insert the 151st record, it will exceed a governor. Okay, why don't we do some of our module review questions associated with the topic of Apex triggers. So who can tell me what are the 7 different types of trigger events? Do the hand counting thing that I enjoy so much.
Before insert, update, delete.
Okay.
After insert, update, delete, and undelete.
Exactly. So it's the before and after of the insert, update, and delete. And then there is the one odd standout, which is the after undelete. Very good. How do you specify that a trigger is a bulk trigger? So this is a trick question. You don't. All right. They're all bulk triggers. So just a little bit of history. Back 5 years ago when Apex was first being released, there was this concept of different types of triggers when they were, in their early access beta program. And what they ended up doing was changing it so that all triggers would be bulk triggers. So we do not specify anything. But when you're writing triggers, always think in bulk. Under what identity do triggers execute? So.
By default, they're without sharing.
Exactly. So they're running in the docs. They'll refer to this as system context, but they run in without sharing mode. And what ramifications does that have?
There's entering massive data that you really don't need to.
Well, I wouldn't say that you don't need to, but it's more along the lines of the person who's currently logged in, who's using whatever it is that you've created. You're going to be able to access all of the records for that object regardless of the sharing model or the ownership. But like I think I brought this up, which is that might be the way that you've designed your solution, because maybe you're doing the thing where you're accessing something like that checking account balance because the user did something else, and now they can't directly access it, but your code can for them. Okay? Do after triggers execute before or after the declarative business logic features? What do you think?
Before?
Another trick question. All right, so we have lots of trick questions here. So if we go back to our 17-step process, which was back here, let's take a look at this. Here we have in step 6 our after triggers, but you could argue that, and I think this would be very true, which is a validation rule is a declarative feature, and so we can prevent records from being written to our database. The other thing is the fact that we might be executing all this stuff, and then we're going to execute our after triggers again. Okay? So it's really the thing that I think the point that's trying to be made with that is that you need to be cognizant of the fact that your after trigger, if it's working in conjunction with a field update, it might be running in this case before an assignment rule, but if it's being re-executed, it might be executing after an assignment rule. How do you access the records that cause the trigger to execute? Trigger.new. So we have our context variables. The new version of the record is right there, and then also the previous version, which is in a variable called trigger.old. Very good. If 1001 rows are added through the API on an S object with a trigger, how many times will that trigger's transactions execute? About 5 times. What about exactly 6? You're correct. It's going to process in 5 batches of 200 and then a single batch of 1. Okay?